What's up, everybody, man? Back. Welcome to a brand new video, and today we're going to be doing another Godzilla discussion video. And in this one, I am not a Godzilla fan, or so I am so often told. I want to talk about the Godzilla fandom for a minute because, yeah, I've got some interesting thoughts on the way the fan culture has been. It's just weird to me, and it's been weird to me ever since I've started making Godzilla content, which is 10 years ago, too long ago, way too long ago. I want to have a chat about the Godzilla fandom because I think it's such a strange place. I am not a Godzilla fan, or so I have been told for the past 10 years. This is how I know that the Godzilla fandom's a very special little bubble, because any single person outside of this fan base will take one look at me and say I'm overly obsessed with Godzilla. Anybody who sees my room, you know how hard it is for people who are not Godzilla people to see the world that I live in, my room, the way I dress, all the Godzilla clothes and merchandise. I'm a walking ad for Godzilla fandom. For them to find out that I have a YouTube channel dedicated to Godzilla, that's a strange thing to introduce to people outside of this fandom. But inside this fandom, yeah, it's interesting because apparently I'm not a Godzilla fan, and I haven't been for the past 10 years. In many ways, Godzilla fandom is the biggest it's been, but also still pretty small. It's easy to forget that while Godzilla is more popular maybe now than he has ever been before, and the fan base is bigger now than it's ever been before, it's actually a rather small, rather cozy fandom, especially online. Online, it's actually a very small little community. There's communities on YouTube, there's communities on Twitter, you know, there's separate communities spread out into the worlds of Godzilla across the internet, but it is kind of a small little fandom, all right? And I think that is important to notice because it's a lot easier to take all of it in at times. Like, most fan bases are so enormous that it's hard to wrap your head around just how big they are. But the Godzilla fandom, it's small enough to still look at all of the pieces of it if you want. It is small enough to grasp at times, especially if you're like just talking about the US fandom, which in this case I am. This conversation doesn't really extend beyond the US fandom, as I have very different experiences outside of that. As with any fandom, there's a huge portion of the Godzilla fandom that measures fandom based on how many toys you own, the merch, how much praise you give each film, how much you defend each film, how much you defend your main character to the death. Fandom is often measured in terms of like how hard you're willing to go to bat for your central character. I think these are all horrible ways to measure fandom. It's cool for people who collect figures, but collecting figures has nothing to do with being a fan. I know some people in the real world who like collect Godzilla figures because they think they look cool and don't really care much for the films. Like, they think Godzilla's a cool looking thing, but they don't love the films, you know? I don't think that's a great metric to say like, well, this person owns a lot of Godzilla stuff, so they must be a huge Godzilla fan. I also do not think it's a good enough metric to see, oh, this person's willing to like get into year-long arguments with someone on Twitter over if Godzilla could beat Goku in a fight. That is not a measure of somebody being a bigger fan than someone else. It just simply is not. Because the fandom is so much smaller than so many other fandoms, these people, I feel like they are especially prominent. Like, you just experience them more, especially if anybody who's watching this has some sort of online presence, you know, whether it be like a fellow YouTuber or whether it be someone who has a Twitter presence or anything like that. Like, if you've got some online presence, you've experienced these types of fans all the time. I don't think fandom is measured in any of these things, and I don't think it should be. Fandom, I don't think really, first of all, can be measured. I don't think it's a measurable topic, but to me, I guess when it comes down to it for me, because I am so passionate about it, I think it's about the quality of the appreciation of the material. It's about how deeply you appreciate the material and how you show that appreciation. I don't think it can really be measured in a nice and easy way. There are some members of the Godzilla community who are very prominent, members who are more prominent than me, who I look at and I see different motivations for why they are so prominent. I don't think it's all the time the quality of their fandom as much as sometimes it can be like the desire for clout. And I've seen that a lot. I've seen a lot of people pop up who desire clout. I don't think that just because they have a bigger platform that they are bigger fans than other people. And I don't love to measure fandom in the first place, but I do think that's also important, as I've seen a lot of people try and measure fandom based on how big of an influence you have. You know, back in the day, I feel like I kind of used to do that when I was younger. Like, I used to think a lot of myself because I had so many followers. And it's a really immature way to look at it. Like, fandom isn't measured in how much of an influence you have or how many followers you have. That doesn't say anything about how big of a fan you are. I know there are channels bigger than mine that talk talk about Godzilla that don't love Godzilla the way that I do. That's fine. The point of this video is because I feel like so often I'm getting hit by a bus that I threw in front of myself. So often I'm taking bullets that I stepped in front of. And so I want to just kind of recap the history of my experience with this fandom, because I know I'm not the only one who has experienced these things. I know people who worked on Godzilla movies, whether in a big capacity or a small capacity, who have dealt with things like this. So I want to go through it. Starting back in 2016, when I started to gain a platform and I started to have people that I was talking to and I was experienced to more of the fandom, I started to be called a fake fan. I was labeled a fake fan back in 2016 for praising Godzilla 2014 so much. I was so in love with that movie, and I was pretty skeptical about Shin Godzilla, especially as the more we learned about it and the more we learned about the radical changes that were made to the movie Shin Godzilla, the less I was excited for that movie. I became really skeptical. I could say verged into like hater material on not looking forward to Shin Godzilla, because I did not fundamentally agree with the big radical changes they were making to Godzilla, making him have these weird Pokemon-esque evolutions that didn't resemble Godzilla's evolution at all. You know, Godzilla had a pretty consistent origin all the way up until 2014 when they changed it to make him a natural creature, but he still felt like Godzilla. Then when you get to Shin Godzilla, he's like a tadpole that turns into Godzilla. It was like a brand new thing. He can shoot lasers out of his back and his tail. He can grow and mutate and all sorts of weird stuff. It was too many big changes for me before the movie came out. I wasn't incredibly receptive of it. So I was accused of being a legendary fanboy, especially because I used to use the term G14 to refer to Godzilla 2014, which for some reason made it seem like I'm in the camp of legendary exclusively, like I didn't look at Godzilla outside of that. I never understood that logic, but I was accused of it a lot. My favorite critique of it was that I was accused of overhyping Godzilla 2, overhyping Godzilla King of the Monsters, although at the time we only knew it as Godzilla 2 and we only knew Michael Dougherty was directing. We didn't know anything about it yet. I was accused of overhyping Godzilla 2 in hopes that it wouldn't live up to the hype so that it would look worse by comparison, and in return make Shin Godzilla look better. Do you see the contradiction there? Suddenly I was a Toho fanboy, because when Shin Godzilla came out, I was a huge fan of it. I loved Shin Godzilla. I was really in love with that movie. The changes worked for me. Maybe it was because I got used to it over the lag from when it came out in Japan to when it came out in America. I got used to the changes that were made, or I like prepared myself for them. And so when I finally saw them, it wasn't as jarring and I was kind of able to accept the movie as it was. Well, now all of a sudden, I'm a big Shin Godzilla fan. I loved it. I thought it was one of the best Godzilla movies ever. And now I'm being accused of being a Toho fanboy who is trying to make the MonsterVerse look worse. Godzilla 2014 and the upcoming Godzilla 2. I was accused of trying to make those movies look worse by comparison to Shin Godzilla. After Shin Godzilla released and I loved it, my reputation amongst legendary Godzilla fans started to be a little shaky, especially getting shaky in mid-2018, I would say, when I was called fake fan simply because of how much I was talking hype on Kong Skull Island. Kong Skull Island connected with me on such a deep level that I could have never seen coming. I was so in love with Kong Skull Island. I always have been a big King Kong fan, but it made me really fall in love with the character and legacy of King Kong as not just a character, but as an icon in cinema history. Like, I really connected with Kong all of a sudden on a level I never had before, and especially I connected with Kong as a character in Legendary's MonsterVerse, which was really important because for the first time in my entire life, I was more hopeful that Kong would come out on top in a potential fight against Godzilla. Like, if you were to look at the Showa series, I find the Showa King Kong to be really goofy, really ridiculous, and while I'm one of the 3 people on Earth who stands by the authorial intent of King Kong versus Godzilla and the original intent of the writer, the original intent of Haruo Nakajima, the original intent of Ishiro Honda, and I stand by the fact that King Kong won in 1962 and was only retconned by Toho later after the fact, I would root for the Showa Godzilla over the Showa King Kong. In the Heisei series, if you're to grab King Kong 1976, scale him up to fight Godzilla in the Heisei series and have those two go at it, I'm rooting for Godzilla. In the Millennium series, kind of a tricky situation, but I guess if you were to scale up Peter Jackson's Kong, at the time I was rooting for Godzilla. Nowadays, I'd actually be rooting for Peter Jackson's Kong, especially because the Millennium era Godzillas like change every single movie, so it's hard to get invested in just one single one of them. But for the first time ever in 2018, we had a Godzilla vs. Kong movie coming out with a Godzilla and a Kong that had been established in separate movies, and for the first time, I was hopeful that Kong would win because I felt like the legacy of King Kong as a cinematic icon, it's more important than anybody gives it credit for, and it's more important to Godzilla's franchise than anybody acknowledges in the fan base. There is no Godzilla without King Kong. So I felt like outside factors made it so that Kong deserved a win. I also felt like I connected with Kong as a character in the MonsterVerse more than I connected with Godzilla in 2014. So all of this sudden, I destroyed my reputation. I was suddenly hated because I was Team Kong. And especially because the more we got closer to Godzilla King of the Monsters, the more I would bring up that Kong stands a chance. And, you know, at the time I was like arguing things like in universe, why Kong would stand a chance. Really, it comes down to just whoever writes the movie determines who wins it. And if a bigger King Kong fan wrote Godzilla versus Kong, Kong would have won. That's just ultimately at the end of the day how it would have gone. And I also never thought Kong was going to win. I was hopeful. And the more people trashed on Kong as a character, on his cinematic legacy, and the more people disrespected Kong, the more I wanted to defend Kong, which is I think what you see with Godzilla fans currently, where like the more opportunity there is for Godzilla and Kong to fight, the more people feel the need to defend Godzilla out of fear that maybe someday that other reality where a writer comes in and gives Kong the win. And I can understand it because I too was really young and immature and fought adamantly that Kong deserved a chance to win that fight. I can at least relate to wanting to argue that your favorite character should win the most. I've never felt as passionate about it as people coming after me saying I was not a Godzilla fan, claiming that I was a fake fan simply because I was rooting for a fictional monkey. And the argument was like, how can you be rooting for a character that isn't your favorite? If Godzilla is supposedly your favorite character, how can you root against him? I root against Godzilla in almost every single movie. Godzilla is my favorite character in every movie, but when I watch Godzilla 1954, I don't hope that the oxygen destroyer blows up in Serizawa's face and Godzilla blows up Ogata and Emiko and then goes and wipes Japan off the face of the earth. I'm rooting against Godzilla in that movie. When I watch Godzilla Raids Again, I'm rooting for them to freeze him in the ice. When I watch Mothra versus Godzilla, I'm rooting for Mothra to throw him into the ocean. It's like I root against Godzilla anytime he's the bad guy, which is the point. You're supposed to. But I also love when Godzilla's the bad guy. I find Godzilla being the bad guy more interesting than Godzilla being the good guy. That's not to say that I'm less of a fan because I rooted against Godzilla, which is the weird misconception that the fan base created and ran with. As I've been saying here, fandom shouldn't be measured by who you root for in a movie. If you rooted for Godzilla in Godzilla vs. Kong, you're not more of a Godzilla fan than somebody who rooted for Kong on the grounds that they rooted for Kong. If you rooted for Godzilla in Godzilla Minus One and you hoped that he was gonna blow up all those ships at the ocean, you're not a bigger Godzilla fan, you need help. What did you take away from that movie? If you wanted Godzilla to kill everybody, that's freaky, man. I don't think fandom should be measured by how much you root for a character. I think it should be measured by how much you love and appreciate the material. This is where things get even more interesting because after King of the Monsters came out in 2018, I was called a King of the Monsters Glazer, a MonsterVerse fanboy, and I wasn't a real Godzilla fan. I was a King of the Monsters Glazer. That's all it was, which I guess I'm still called that to this day. As Minus One started to approach, we're skipping a couple years here because this is all the Godzilla vs. Kong debate going on. As Godzilla Minus One approached, I was called a Toho fanboy, and I'm still called this all the time, a Toho fanboy, a fake fan, because for the first time since Godzilla has come back to theaters in 2014, I found myself disappointed and more critical with a movie than I was in love with it, and that was with Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. So for the first time ever, I watched a Godzilla film and it didn't connect with me the way I hoped it would, which by comparison makes it seem like I love Minus One against it, because Minus One came out so close to it, and Minus One is like my favorite Godzilla movie. Those two things, they are separate entities. My love for Godzilla Minus One is separate than my disappointment with The New Empire. Those are two separate things, two separate conversations. They get brought up a lot because they got released so close to each other, but they are not the same thing. And me being disappointed with a movie that I still liked, it doesn't make me less of a fan than somebody who straight up loved The New Empire. Maybe it means you like The New Empire more than me, but that doesn't matter, and I don't think it should. That shouldn't be a measure of how deep of a fan you are. And the best way I can prove this is the Godzilla Anime Trilogy. You guys hated the Godzilla Anime Trilogy. You hated it. I know some of you guys in this chat might not, like Godzilla King of Kaiju is a fan of the anime movies like I am, but if me having major issues with the Godzilla film that I still like New Empire, makes me a fake fan, then what are you, the average viewer who hated the Anime Trilogy? I loved those movies. I loved the Godzilla Anime Trilogy. I was one of the only people defending them when they came out. People were always attacking me for loving the Anime Trilogy, always calling me an idiot, saying that I had bad taste, saying that, again, like, you're a fake fan for defending these don't even have anything to do with Godzilla, he's barely in them. They're still Godzilla movies, are they not? If you're supposed to say like, well, I love every Godzilla movie, and that makes me more of a fan than you. What a ridiculous concept. That's not how you measure fan base. People hated the Anime Trilogy. People were very critical of Singular Point. I loved both of these projects. I really loved the Anime Trilogy. I'm one of the, still to this day, a shameless defender of it, one of the only ones, and I loved Singular Point when so many others didn't. That doesn't make me a bigger fan than someone who didn't like those projects. The truth is, at the end of the day, all that matters to me is that I love good stories well told, and I love them even more when Godzilla is in them. I love Godzilla. I love seeing new incarnations of Godzilla. I love when filmmakers take big swings with Godzilla, like in Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, a movie that gives Godzilla a silly redesign, a radical alteration, gives him all these, like, he's got all these abilities, he can supercharge, he's flying around the anti-gravity field, all these big swings that didn't work for me. I love that they tried it, because I love Godzilla, and I love to see new things with Godzilla. And it's so silly to me that I'm considered a fake fan for being critical of certain movies as they're coming out, and just like ignoring the grand scope of how much I love Godzilla. And at the end of the day, the real reason I'm making this video, I've been getting a lot of comments saying that I'm a fake fan lately because I've had some more critical discussions on the MonsterVerse, and I think that's ridiculous. And also because I wanted to promote Growing Up with Godzilla, a series I was just in with Donnie Winters. I had a wonderful time on that show. I really think you should go check it out. I'll link it down below. I've shouted it out on the community page. I've shouted it out. Growing Up with Godzilla is a wonderful series. Donnie does an incredible job hosting it. It invites you into seeing how different people perceive Godzilla differently. It shows the wide range of love people have for Godzilla throughout their whole lives. I've loved Godzilla throughout my whole life. If you want to hear my story with Godzilla, you can go check out that video. There's 2 of them. Go check both of those out. I love Godzilla. If you want to hear about my actual fandom, go check those videos out. And if you don't like to have critical discussions on Godzilla, that's completely fine. You might not like my videos, but that doesn't mean that I'm not a fan of Godzilla. I think that we as a fan base really need to get comfortable with 2 things. Number 1, this is something that Kaiju Canuck brought up on that same series, Growing Up with Godzilla. Kaiju Canuck had this wonderful message at the end of the series, which is you shouldn't feel compelled or obligated to love everything. There's so much Godzilla. Godzilla exists in so many different forms. He can be a chibi cartoon for 3-year-olds, and he can be an Oscar-winning, dramatic, horrific symbol of the nuclear apocalypse. And those 2 things can happen in the same exact year. You shouldn't have to feel compelled to like everything or to love everything. For me, there are still, I think there's one Godzilla movie that I will say I do not like. Just one. One Godzilla movie out of the entire franchise that I would say I don't like, because I've grown to love and have an appreciation for every single Godzilla film except this one. And I don't hate it. I just don't like it. And that's Godzilla vs. Megalon. And I'm glad that there are people out there who love that movie. I'm glad that it connects with some people. It just doesn't connect with me. No matter how many times I watch it, it doesn't connect with me. It's actually one of my more watched Godzilla movies because I'm trying to convince myself to love it. It just doesn't hit for me. And that's fine that some of you guys love that movie. That's fine that some of you guys adamantly hate that movie, but that doesn't make me more of a fan than anybody else. And that doesn't make me less of a fan than anybody else. You shouldn't feel obligated to love everything. And the other thing, I think this is so incredibly important. We need to grow more comfortable as a fan base criticizing our favorite movies and our favorite characters, because we should ask for better. We should ask for better than what we're given. If you loved New Empire, that's so great. I'm really glad you loved that movie. I wish I loved it. I don't think it's a terribly well-written movie, and I've brought up why video after video. And if you watch my videos and you still disagree, that's completely fine. I've not seen anybody counter any of my critiques in a way that dissipates them, you know, that absolves them, that makes it so like, oh yeah, I wasn't wrong about that. Not that I think you should, as I don't think it's your job to convince somebody else to love this movie, and I don't think it's my job to convince somebody else to have issues with that movie. I think we need to grow more comfortable criticizing the things we love. Generally speaking, there are issues with the New Empire that need addressing, and if you don't want to acknowledge that, that's fine. If you truly don't see it, that's also fine. So many people see it. So many people can see it. There are issues that need to be addressed with that movie, whether it just be the score, moving on from that score and that composer and asking for something else, or whether it be asking for more consistency in the visual effects, or whatever, asking for more thoughtful storytelling. I do think that there are things that we should be asking for higher standards on. Same with the Godzilla Anime Trilogy. Like, even me, someone who loves those movies, should be comfortable criticizing the the way those movies had major budget cuts that completely destroyed the original story that was going to be told and limited the visual aesthetic of those movies, limited the pacing, limited the action. We should be comfortable criticizing elements of our favorite films. We should be comfortable criticizing elements of our least favorite films. We should be comfortable criticizing elements of our favorite interpretations of Godzilla, and we should be comfortable criticizing elements of our least favorite interpretations of Godzilla, the same way that we should be comfortable praising elements of our least favorite Godzillas and our least favorite Godzilla movies. If you're a hardcore diehard of the new films and you don't love any of the other Godzilla films, there are still issues with the scripts, there are issues with the long-term storytelling across all of those movies, and we should be comfortable to criticize those aspects of them because we should want better. We should want better, as long as you're doing it in a positive, productive, constructive way. I know that there are other YouTubers out there who share my opinions, but don't express it out of fear of being labeled as fake fans. I know that there are other people like me who know for a fact if they criticize these movies the way that I do, which is opinions that they share, and in some cases they have even more extreme opinions than me, they know their channel's growth will be stunted the same way mine was, and they will be labeled as a fake fan. That's an awful way to look at it. Thank you guys all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Especially big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. It's the best way to support this channel, the most direct way to support this channel. If you want to support the Patreon, you can use the link in the description below. Through that, you can get early access to content, access to the Discord community, and more. If that's not your thing, please consider joining the channel as a channel member. It gets you exclusive perks. And that'll do it for this one, guys. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all next time for the next one. D-Man, out.